And our class today is an extension of what we were learning last week, where we are exploring some of the moments, the pivotal moments that precipitated the state of Israel, not only its formation, but also what may be some of the complicating issues that do create the conflicts that separate people all across the spectrum with their ideas of what Israel is or how Israel should behave or comport itself in the world. And so today, what we're going to focus on, less historical, even though there are historical moments, but really sort of the political moves. What are the specific moments in political history that precipitated the formation of the state? And we'll talk about the kind of origins of what's known as political Zionism. We'll talk about the Balfour Declaration today, which is a crucial piece of history, of literary history, that was the first formal acknowledgement that there needed to be a land in what was known as Palestine, or was the sort of Middle East under the British Empire, that would be designated ideally for the Jewish people. We'll talk about a little bit of sort of what were the machinations of the Zionist idea, so much so that it was willing to even consider other places besides Israel because of the sort of imperative of what it meant for the Jewish people to have a nation in modernity. And then ultimately, I have like just one artifact to kind of share a little bit about that Uganda plan, and just so you can see that as a specific piece of political history. So that's what we're going to study today, and we'll jump right in. Before I do, I want to add, Lori Woldar was in like Hebrew High a few years ago, and she has, this is awesome, she has her test. I assume it was Hebrew High, right? She has her test on Zionism from like umpteen years ago. And what I'm going to do is, it came in 17 individual documents. Thank you very much for that. My email was like just abounds with Lori Woldar emails. And
Sorry about that.
it's all good. And what I'm going to try to do is I'll see if I can collate them. And I think it's a wonderful thing for us to play with as well, of like, what is our basic knowledge of Zionist history, who are the people and the figures. And the reason that it's sort of fun to play with it is because this could be an entire class on Zionism. That's what this class is not. This is about how to talk about Israel, basically. And part of that is understanding Zionism. And if you want to have a class on Zionism in depth, which today is just going to be a flavor of it, then I highly recommend spending time. I mean, it could be, it's an entire course. It's a degree. There's enough material there to have a degree in the subject. Just parenthetically, it's so awesome. Did you see in the news that they've now created an advanced placement course in African American studies? Right. This is sort of the evolution of the history of Africans in America, and in particular, sort of slavery, civil rights, and then modern issues, that have now qualified to be a course that students in high school could take to qualify for college credit. I think it's fantastic. So if you haven't seen it, just pay attention to it. What it's saying is that there's an evolution here that is unfolding with African American history, that it's significant and substantial enough to really dig deeply. It transcends the particularity, and it sort of reaches the sort of Western civilization concepts of freedom and dignity and all the things that we talk about through the Jewish lens. They're also visible through the African American lens. One more interesting little tidbit of facts in our stories today before we jump in. Did you see that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is releasing a new character called Sabra Girl? Did you see this? Okay, so I'm telling you a couple things that you need to get. I gave you that article on Mo. If you haven't subscribed to the forward, it's a good one to subscribe to. I'm 50-50 on the forward, but the Jewish Telegraphic Agency (JTA) has a thing called the Daily Briefing. Last week I recommended that you get the Daily Alert. And now I recommend that you explore the Jewish Telegraphic Agency Daily Briefing, which is primarily American focused centric, but it's a lot more like cultural stuff. And it's interesting because they announce these things. It's like everything Jewish is a topic of interest for this news feed, and they release that there's a new hero that is based on an Israeli. I don't know the story. I assume that she's like an Israeli like super military, superhero. And already there's like celebration and consternation about it. It's just such a fascinating thing when you're looking at how the world views Jews in modernity. And I just ask you to hold on to all of that. Not only like Lori stuff and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but also the reality that we cannot possibly study everything that we're going to study today in its entirety. It deserves a class on its own. However, what you need is a little bit of understanding of how did we get here from a political perspective. So that's what we're going to spend our time today focused on. And let me get the text. Hopefully this is the right one. Can everybody see this? Yes? Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. And I tell you what, there we go. All right, so this is a wonderful kind of like history of political Zionism, and I invite us to read it a little bit together so we can understand what we're talking about. Linda Hyman, do you feel like reading a little bit this morning?
Yes.
Great.
The Zionist movement developed into a politically dynamic force with the I'm not getting that word out. Emergence of
Meteor.
Emergence of Theodor Herzl and the convening of the first Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland in 1897. In the beginning of his career, Herzl held the conventional view of the Europeanized Jewish intellectuals of the late 19th century, that the process of assimilation would lead to the full integration of Jews within their home societies. This view, however, was soon revised once he encountered anti-Semitism following the publication of Eugene During book on the Jewish problem and the Dreyfus trial in 1894, in which a Jewish captain within the French general staff was falsely accused of spying for Germany and sentenced to life in prison. Dreyfus was exonerated 12 years after he was first charged, but it was the anti-Semitic environment surrounding his original trial that provoked Herzl, who was covering the event as a journalist, to realize that assimilation had failed and that it was futile to combat anti-Semitism in Europe. At that moment, the Jewish question was transformed from a social and religious problem to a national one. Herzl subsequently became the founder and leader of the political Zionists.
Thank you very much. So pause right there. Just digest this for a moment, right? Okay, so just make sure, I'm gonna leave it on the screen for a second and then I'm gonna take it off because I want us to have a conversation. All right, so just as you're looking, pivotal moments are Dreyfus Affair and this book by the German, I think he's German, Eugene Düring, called The Jewish Problem. Okay, it's in 1894. Now we know that the Shoah is going to be the most catastrophic dark cloud that covers Europe in the middle of the 20th century. So this is roughly 40 years prior to this, okay? 1933, the Nazis emerge, and by then they're already sort of, issuing edicts, Nuremberg trials, final Kristallnacht 39, and then I'm sorry, 38, and then in 39 World War II begins all the way until 44. So in that moment, this is obviously 40 years prior, but the move to recognizing that that Jews will never be able to fully assimilate into European society prompted Herzl to seek out a solution to this never-ending problem. So the concept of a political need to respond to Jewish history really emerged at this moment. And if you think about history up until this time, did Jews have any political power? They had political power in the golden age of Spain. We have stories of the Jews, the court Jew in the palace of Ferdinand and Isabella. And we have this time, it's called the Golden Age, when the Jewish the Jewish community and Jewish people were celebrated and regarded for their intellectual achievements, for their cultural achievements. And even then, so at the end of that era, we have the great catastrophe of the Inquisition and expulsion of the Jews from Spain. And you have this sort of culmination. So that's like 1490, 14 in the 1400s, and the early 1500s. And you have the Jews now going into dispersion into Europe. And over a period of 400 or 500 years, there's assimilation that takes place. So the Jews are feeling pretty darn good, especially in 1700. We studied this before in another class when we started talking about the period of the Enlightenment and Moses Mendelssohn. Moses Mendelssohn comes onto the scene and says, look, the Jew has an invaluable place in contributing to the betterment of science and culture and literacy and all kinds of things that make the citizens of Europe great. The Jews are a part of that. And then you have Herzl, who is the most secular Jewish person. It's like he didn't even really know that he was Jewish. He doesn't really grow up with Judaism, and he's a journalist. If you just reiterating the story, I'm sure you've heard it 100 times. But he goes to cover the Dreyfus trial, and when he sees Alfred Dreyfus, who is a French officer, supposed to be judged for his accusations of treason, which he was 12 years later adjudicated, or he was, what do you call it? He was acquitted from. That in that moment, when they should have been yelling traitor, 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 they were yelling Jew, Jew, Jew. And that is when Herzl said, oh my God. It's like one of those moments that we still relive in again, and just remember that this is the world that the Jewish mind occupies. We are a part of the world, accepted. We can be officers in the nations that we are citizens of in the world. And when there is something that is contentious or that is problematic, or there's an accusation, it doesn't come across that we are a traitor to the citizenship of the country to which we belong. We are Jews. That's what Herzl realized, and so therefore he sets about the project in trying to create a state. So it's an important and influential moment, and it's historical in the sense that it happens in 1894, but it's a mindset. It's a shifting mindset. It's the moment when he says, all this freedom that we have, it's time for us to take this freedom and to bring it to a place where we can have our own ability of self-determination. Okay, right? That's why self-determination should sound very familiar to you, because it's also the very same language that was used in the American Revolution and in the French Revolution. And the whole concept of nationalism had been budding for 100 years. And so Herzl says, look, if they can do it in America and they can do it in France, well, then they can do it for the Jewish people in Israel. And we need to go home. Okay? All right. Any comments or reactions to that as a pivotal moment? Roberta S.
Why at that time was there so much anti-Semitism? What was the change?
So that's the thing. There wasn't anything. there wasn't anything that was patently anti-Semitic at all. This is France. France was a newly democratic country. It had already been living for 100 years with its democracy, okay, which later becomes a little bit more of a socialist democratic republic, but it still has a democracy. There's elections, there's people who vote, right? And how they govern themselves is determined by the people. They've asserted self-determination as a people. They don't rely upon a monarch. And the Jew is as much a part of that as any other place in the world. So it's a good question, and it's a good comment. There was nothing explicit. That's the issue. There was nothing explicit. It's not like there were pogroms taking place in Eastern Europe, because they weren't. I mean, they kind of were, but like they really weren't. Not then. Yes. And even if they were, to Herzl, who lived in Western Europe, the most civilized place on the planet, he was saying it could never happen here until he saw it happening here. Jay. You have to unmute. And Jay, can we see you? Can you see us?
I can see you now. Thanks.
Oh, that's good.
Thanks. To me, it's surprising that Herzl needed this moment to wake up to the fact that the world has always had a Jewish problem. I mean, was he not a student of history? Didn't he see that? Again, you mentioned the Spanish, the Inquisitions, and I mean, there's plenty of evidence that for 3,000 years before, or 5,000, whatever it was, that it was very difficult to be a Jew, and that the world had a Jewish problem or Jewish question. Why did it take this specific event to wake this guy up?
Right. So it's a great question, a great observation. And just to reiterate, Theodor Herzl was the most secular assimilated citizen that you could find in Austria at the time, right? Like he was, in Hungary, right? He's, his birthplace synagogue is in Hungary, okay? And the Dohani synagogue, which was like the most majestic synagogue if you've ever been there, right? That's where Theodor Herzl comes from. And you know what? It's like he is like the typical American Jew who says, I'm an American, I live in American, like my value system is an American value system. It might have I might identify it as Jewish, but like for the most part, I identify it as American. I know that I have this history, but it doesn't affect me, right? Like my day, think about how much you happen to be. I mean, we might be preaching to the choir, right? But like you probably, if you do a really good analysis of what you do during your day, and you sort of like mark how much of what you do is Jewish or informed by your Jewish identity, you would probably find that it's a mishmash, right? At the very least, like there's different pieces, and only somebody who's like constantly aware of their history is able to acknowledge this. So it takes these these cathartic or these cataclysmic moments to be able to like realize, oh my God, something's wrong. Let me put a parenthesis around it because it's an important point. So now you have post-Holocaust American identity, and you have, when we talk about Israel, you have this tug and this pull, and it's really sort of playing itself into into sort of like people's attitudes towards Israel, because people will say that we have to support unequivocally whatever Israel does, because we remember that the world, even if the world accepts us, the world doesn't really accept us. So no matter what, Israel is always in the right, because it's only going to be the place that's going to save us. That's the attitude that is out there expressed by some. Then you have most of the Jewish world, okay? Most of the Jewish world recognizes that the world needs Israel. Most of the Jewish world recognizes that there is a history of anti-Semitism, but because they don't experience it on a daily basis, even though we see in the news that the number of anti-Semitic incidents have increased, precipitously in the last couple of years, even though that's true, I don't feel anti-Semitism when I walk into my grocery market. Not at all. Especially here in Sherman Oaks and Encino. Okay, so the issue for Dreyfus is he's walking in the world. If he wants to be Jewish, he can be Jewish. If he wants to be French, he can be French. If he wants to be Austrian, he can be Austrian. He can be whatever he wants because he's a citizen of the world. Until he sees Dreyfus being vilified not for his treason against the French army, but for his Jewish identity. That I think is actually pretty important. So that was a long response to the point. It's why it's really pivotal, because what Herzl, here's the point, is it's that happened to him, and then it's like, what did he do? So let's read. Okay? All right, we're going to skip. So this quick paragraph is that he tried with plays because he was a journalist and a playwright. Okay, and he wasn't a very good playwright apparently, but he turned out to be a very good politician. So Jay, you want to read? Herzl was a man of action.
We lose him?
No.
Sorry about that. Okay. Herzl's ideology, which he
skip the next paragraph.
Okay. Herzl was a man of action and a great diplomat, shifting his focus from one capital to another in response to political opportunities. He first turned to several prominent Jewish figures, including Baron de Hirsch, who was the founder of the Jewish settlements in Argentina, chief rabbi of Vienna, and the Rothschild family, in the hope that they would be receptive to his idea. Following these failed attempts, he later found Die Welt, the Zionist movement's weekly newspaper, the financial arm of the movement known as the Jewish Colonial Trust. And in August 1897, the Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland. In the diplomatic arena, Herzl negotiated with Kaiser Wilhelm, the Sultan of Turkey, the King of Italy, Pope Pius X, the Russian Minister of the Interior, and many other Gentile leaders. It was the first time in history that a Jewish national program was placed on the international political agenda. In these meetings, Herzl presented the fundamental ideas of Zionism and the necessity to apply a realpolitik view to constructively solve the, quote, Jewish problem.
Okay, good. Do one more paragraph and then we'll stop and take a break.
Perhaps Herzl's most controversial move was his support of the British proposal in 1903 for a Jewish settlement in Uganda under the British flag. Herzl justified the move on the grounds that of political pragmatism by claiming it politically unwise to reject an offer made by a great power that recognized the Zionist movement. Furthermore, the acceptance of the British offer would bring about the realization of the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine nearer as great powers began to comprehend the fertility of this idea.
Very good. Okay, so now, so what's happened is Herzl has this profound realization, and he says, you know what, I just watched the United States of America, undergo a revolution and create a state. I just watched France do it. I just saw that all these other countries in Europe are proclaiming self-determination. It's in the water. It's in the air. Everybody's excited about creating their own nation. Well, why shouldn't the Jews have a nation of their own, right? That's what his thinking was. So then he goes to all the wealthy, rich Jews that he knows, Hirsch and the chief rabbi of Vienna and Rothschild family, and he says, let's go get some money. And he starts to develop some money and he create a trust. I want you to be very, very conscious of the word of this trust, Jewish Colonial Trust. Okay, we're going to talk in 2 weeks about the sense of colonialism that Israel is a colonizing force, and that it's creating apartheid in the land by subjugating the citizens of the Palestinian territories as subjects, and they're subjugated. Those terms are also terms that are used when trying to identify the establishment of the state of Israel. Right? His concept was to colonize Uganda. And we'll talk about that as well when we get to the Uganda plan in a couple of minutes. In the meantime, Herzl's going around and he starts to do something that is really important. And notice what's happening. How did we get here? What Herzl does is he says, we have to play the game that the world plays when it comes to national identity. Keep in mind that 150 years ago, there were kings and there were empires, and all of a sudden there are nations and there's a United States of America. That political shift is what enables Herzl to propose that there should be a political entity for the Jewish people to govern themselves. Okay? He didn't care if they were religious Jews. He didn't care if they were, agnostic or atheist, right? What he cared about was that the Jewish people would have a right to self-determination. Okay. Last piece on the side with the text here, right, was that he proposes the settlement of Uganda, and he does it with pragmatism, hoping that Uganda is a stepping stone to Palestine. Okay, thank you, Jay, for reading that. And Barbara Anik, do you want to read a little bit more of this story?
Sure. Following the Kishinev pogroms of 1903, Herzl foresaw further persecutions. In fact, he predicted that a Jewish catastrophe was imminent, a prediction that was tragically realized during the Second World War. Herzl sought, therefore, a temporary haven in Uganda as an emergency measure and not as a rejection of a territorial base in Eretz Yisrael. His wish, however, never came to fruition. Although he won support at the 6th Zionist Congress to dispatch an investigation commission to East Africa, Russian Zionists, led by Chaim Weizmann, lined up against him. The blow to Herzl's prestige, as well as the attempted murder of Max Nordau, co-founder of the WZO along with Herzl, left Herzl profoundly depressed. A year later, the British government withdrew its offer. Herzl's health deteriorated considerably during 1903, and he died the following year.
Okay, so interesting. A little bit about Herzl's history is that he pushes for Uganda. He's pushing so hard for Uganda that the other leaders of the World Zionist Congress, and just notice in this paragraph that there's a 6th and eventually we're going to talk about a 7th. The first one is in 1897. 1897, 98, 99, 1900, 1, 2, 3, okay? There's potentially 8 Zionist Congresses that are going to take place before Herzl dies, okay? Let's go ahead and finish it up, Barbara. And hold on, Sherry, let's finish it up and then we'll talk about it.
After Herzl's death, there was no hope for a breakthrough for the Zionist movement until the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, which at that time included Palestine. The leadership of the Zionist movement therefore moved from the hands of those who sought a political solution to those who supported a more practical orientation in the form of the steady immigration of Jews to Palestine and the development of the infrastructure for a Jewish homeland.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So this is a little bit of the sort of foundations of what's going on. So first, this is where I think we need 27 classes, because you need to learn about Max Nordau. You need to learn about Chaim Weizmann. You need to learn about Chad Am, right? There's all these different sort of layers of Zionism that are coalescing at this very same time. They're all pushing in the same direction, but they're all doing it from different angles. There's a religious Zionism. There's a cultural Zionism. There's a political Zionism. There are all these different moves from different ideas. But for us, the purpose of our reading is that Herzl says there is a problem. Jews do not have a place in the world. They're always going to be subject to. And if every place that they are, they're going to be judged as Jews, as in the Dreyfus affair, then the Jew is never going to be settled. So I'm going to set about resolving the problem by using the political pushes and pulls, the maneuvering that's happening in the world at the same time. And I'm going to advocate for the Jewish people to have a homeland. Obviously, it should be in the land of Palestine, right? Because that's, we have a historical connection to that. But you know what? Uganda will be just fine. Uganda will be just fine. Why will Uganda be just fine? Because what's more important? The power of Jewish self-determination. being in a place where if somebody, like, this is a great Ben Gurion quote, right? The people will have a state when there are Jewish thieves and there are Jewish criminals and there's Jewish prostitutes, right? We'll know we'll have a state when we are taking responsibility and mediating justice for our own people. Not like Brittany Griner, right? Is that her name? Right? In Russia right now? Like, it's a terrible thing. It's a really terrible thing. You know that she's a pawn. It's an awful thing. It has nothing to do with her. It has everything to do with her American identity, her professional identity. It might even be her racial and her sexual identity if you wanted to undergo that. The fact that the Jew was subject to that in every place in the world, okay, except for the United States, finally in the 20th century, in the 21st century now, that we need a place in which we can take our own responsibility. So Herzl does this, people don't like it, he gets sick and he dies. Now, this article has it that it was like one was sort of like causing the other, but I think he was like, by the way, he was like 50 years old when he died, right? These people are just like shining lights that come and they sort of like burst into the constellations of the universe, and they sort of like, they wither, or they sort of fade into the stardust of the universe, but leave a residue that has irreparably changed the constellations of the world. That's what Herzl did, right? In a brief amount of time. Really, really important stuff. Okay, Sherry, you had your hand up and I was like babbling. Yeah. Oh.
Tina.
Yeah. Go ahead.
What was the Argentina Hirsch?
Werner Hirsch, right? Do you remember that book that you guys recommended? Do you guys remember the story of the Russians who are leaving? I forgot what it's called, but it's all about like the guy who goes and gets the Russian girl and brings her.
Yeah.
And she's like a prostitute, right? It's horrible. What's it called?
Right. The third daughter.
The third daughter, right?
Oh, right.
Right. So like, why Argentina? Because Werner Hirsch goes to Argentina and sets up and establishes a very thriving Jewish community, right? But even still, even in Argentina, they're citizens of Argentina. You know what? And Jews have done really well in Argentina up until the bombing in the 90s. Maybe you remember, but still, if you've ever been to Buenos Aires, it's like one of the most lovely, joyful, exciting expressions of Jewish culture.
So it was there, and then people also went after the war as a place to go.
Correct, right? Why? So when Jews were fleeing Europe, where did they go? They went to Argentina. They went to the United States if they could get in. They went to Canada. They went to Palestine, right?
South Africa.
And a little bit to South Africa, and then a little bit to like, Asia, China, right?
Right.
So there were all these like dispersions where people would go because they could get out. So it's a very interesting thing in the story that we talk, you bring up that point, is that like having Jewish havens throughout the world is a good thing for the Jews. So the end of the story here isn't that everybody should go live in Israel. That's not the end of the story. Linda.
I don't know if it was in 95 or after, but we went to visit Herzl's tomb. And when you entered the cemetery to the left, there was a place where they had plays about Herzl's life. And they brought every young soldier to see the play because they didn't know who Herzl was. And
Yeah, amazing, right?
These are the young, now a lot of them were Black, they were Ethiopian soldiers, but across the board, the young people did not realize what Herzl had contributed to their being in Israel at that point.
It's a really beautiful comment. So two responses. One is there's now a Herzl museum in the cemetery, in that exact place that's left. It's a beautiful it's actually a really wonderful exhibit, and it's all about Theodore Herzl. This guy's trying to play Theodore Herzl, and you go through his stories, and it's all about him being a playwright. So basically they elevate the playwright to his great production. The greatest production that Theodore Herzl could put on is called The Founding of the State of Israel. It's beautiful, right? And then as well, if you guys read Jacoby's book, because there's a couple like just kernels that are so beautiful. And at the end of the book, she starts talking about her friend who doesn't come from Eastern Europe background. And she's talking about why she's like responding to the complaint of her friend, who's as Israeli as she is. How come I'm learning about Bialik and Herzl and Chernikovsky and all these people who are Russian and Eastern European founders of the state? Why don't I know about my people, my ancestors, and my story? And again, I think that that's a beautiful comment to what we were just talking about. The fact that there's an AP African American Studies course that you could take in high school is redemptive. It is so fantastic. I wish I could take it myself because having the ability to hear different layers of history in order for me to contain all of this, that's what's going to make me an excellent American. And the same thing when it comes to Israel, right? The same thing when it comes to Israel. So it's a very good point. That's why they do the thing with the soldiers. Pam.
I'm collecting thoughts. I hope I get them all out. Starting with a funny one, I think. One of my dearest friends, my mentor, who's no longer with us, who's not Jewish, said that we should have just given Baja California to the Jews and let them, yeah. Anyway,
Cabo San Lucas would have been just fine with me, by the way.
Yeah. I had a thought of a couple of segments ago that, and it's a rhetorical question: what if we, as the Jewish people, weren't so prominent? Would we be hated as much if we weren't the scientists and the technology inventors? And if we didn't excel so much with our brains, would we still be who we are as a people and persecuted? And the third thing I want to say is a little bit off topic, but Sunday I saw a fantastic play called If I Forget, and it's if you've seen it, you know that it's fabulous. It's very thought-provoking. It's on hiatus right now at the Fountain Theater, but it's coming back in mid-October, and Jason Alexander is directing it. So nice. If you get a chance to go see it, they require masks indoors, and it's really thought-provoking.
Very nice, very nice. I want to respond, but Sherry has some things. Yeah.
Lori and I and Jay saw it Saturday night. Amazing.
Yeah, it's good.
You all need to see it.
Thank you for adding that. And so you know, the question that you asked, Pam, is the perennial question, right? Why do they hate us so much? Or the other side of it is, if we weren't such a problem. I mean, listen to that. Right. If we weren't such a problem, would they hate us so much? What an attitude to sort of like carry. And it's deep in the psyche of anybody who feels persecuted or victimized, right? Like if you talk to people who are victims of abuse, and they will say, did I do something wrong? Right? Am I not worthy of the love that I deserve? What did I do to deserve this? And really, like, what did I do to deserve this? So the victim mentality is unfortunately and historically engraved in the Jewish mind. It's not just a couple experiences, it's there. So the fact that you ask it at this particular moment, but throughout our class, is understandable. However, look at the other side of it, right? And just think about what's the story that we're telling, right? The state of Israel, the Jewish people, contribute more to the betterment of humanity disproportionately than any other human group ever in the history of humanity, ever. And the fact that we have that as a story is not only laudatory, it's celebratory, but it also brings consternation and it vilifies us. So I almost think that, like, you know, I don't think that we can ever really answer that question. I think that it says, like, we feel that, but it's more like we have work to do. Like we have gifts. We have a responsibility to share those gifts wherever we're able to share them. Let us do that, even if it means that there's consequences that come as a result. And I would say that's what makes the Jewish mindset heroic. Again, to bring back something that we talked about in our class when we began. Hi, Jeannie. Unmute.
It's a little bit off of where we are at this moment in the conversation, but you've brought up the Jewish Policemen's Union book.
Yiddish Policemen's Union, yeah.
Yeah, and Yiddish police, I read that, and I read a lot of reviews after I read it, seeing if someone else picked up what I did. But to me, the essence of that story, the protagonist was to me representative of the Jewish people. We, in that story, it portrays the Jews as receiving a homeland in Alaska, if I'm not mistaken. I read it a number of years ago. There was such a sense of emptiness in this man. And there was, we were amongst Native people of the Northwest. We were still not home. And there was just, if you have a chance to read it, that's what I took away with it. And so my point is that, to me, we were supposed to be in Israel. We were supposed to be in Israel, and all these other choices were, they were second choice, and it was a safe haven. But to me, there was something visceral. There was something ordained that we had to be there, and all these other choices. And that's a real good example of, we just never fit in. They were still speaking Yiddish. It was just a projection of what we left in Europe. Sorry.
Yeah. No, that's great. Great point. And great to bring it up now, because the concept is, not only is it about Uganda, by the way, there was, talk about Texas. I think I quoted it, one of the pieces that I was preparing, Texas, Arizona, other parts of the world, Iraq. Like, there were lots of places that were on the table to be considered. And the fact that they were being considered, even if those were ever granted, it was always going to be a longing for it. That's why Chaim Weizmann and others really opposed Herzl's political move to get Uganda. Herzl wanted this to happen before he died, right? Like, he was already sick by the time that he was really pushing for Uganda. And for him, it was kind of like a question of legacy. Maybe his ego got a little bit into that. The irony of the story is that not only does Herzl not get to see the foundation of the state of Israel, but it would have happened in his lifetime had he survived, is pretty extraordinary. The idea that we could never settle on any other place other than Israel is another one of those deep grooves in the psyche of the Jewish mind. That's your point. And it's a good point. Okay? All right, let's read one more or two more, and then we'll take a little break. Okay? So now, what I wanted to show with you, you'll hear when you're talking about the kind of like the political formation of the state of Israel, the Balfour Declaration, which happens in 1917. Remember what's happening in 1917? It's the World War I. Okay, so World War I is I'm not exactly sure before or after at this moment. World War I, by the way, for us who really are finishing up a pandemic, right? That's kind of like, that was also right before the pandemic. So there's an interesting sort of pregnant time in history. And when you hear the Balfour Declaration, it sounds like it's this like grandiose, unbelievable document of history. Candy, do you want to read?
Sure. Balfour Declaration to the Foreign Office, November 2nd, 1917. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been subjected to
Submitted
to. Ooh, that's a good one. And approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government's view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful to you. Oh, I'm sorry. I would be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. Yours, Arthur James Balfour.
Right, great. So 1917, remember, Herzl's already passed away for 13 years. And the Lord Rothschild that he was seeking money from this is the guy who's, basically a court Jew, if you will, in the sort of, British government before, after World War II, things changed dramatically. And he is the representative of the Jewish people in England. And he gets this letter, and pay attention to it. I mean, I think that this is the stuff that's pretty significant. He says, we view this with favor, and it's clearly understood that nothing shall be done which prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. Okay, so the English, this is pre-mandate Palestine. Okay, the end of the Ottoman Empire is at the end of World War I, and the British government takes over the land of Palestine. And the first thing that they do is they make this declaration to say, we're going to apportion out this land for the Jewish people to make a homeland. Okay? Sounds great. Why didn't there happen to be a state right after that? I don't know. We're going to have to keep studying. Okay, let's do a little bit more. Thank you for reading, Candy. Fran, are you up for reading? Now, as you're reading, Barbara, go ahead while you're doing that, and then I'll qualify. Yes, Barbara.
I guess my question is, this is going to sound very probably anti-Semitic. Were they wanting to just export all the Jews and get rid of them out of Britain? No?
No, because Britain's attitude towards the Jewish community was very, it's about the same as it is today. Very favorable, they're not us, but and we're not them, but we can live side by side, and and there's respect, and there's commercial enterprises, and a lot of a lot of overlap that happens between the two communities. This is not about solving the Jewish problem for Europe, because they could have lived in England, right? This is about the political response that Herzl raises in 1897 at the World Zionist Congress to say, there's a need for us to have a place in the world where Jews can exercise their own right of self-determination. And to transition into that, and I'm sorry, Fran, you're going to read. You'll see it says Jewish nationalism in context. A land for a people without a land. This was one of the early concepts, and you would think that it was coined by someone Jewish, but it was actually coined, according to historical understanding, by the Christian community when they were thinking about what should happen with the Jewish people, and everybody was moving towards a favorable resolution of a state of Israel or a nation of Israel to be formed. Before we go, Jeannie, you have your hand raised, and then Fran, you'll read.
I just wanted to briefly interject when you said why did the idea get dropped? From all the historical reading that I've been doing, to me it looks like it was prior to World War II and soon after prior to World War II, soon after World War I, that they started to discover all the oil that was in the Middle East. And they were all searching for where it was, because they knew that was going to drive, the industrial, revolution further throughout the world. And they knew how valuable it would be. And I believe that part of the reason they stopped supporting it was because they didn't really want the Jews there. They wanted to support the Arabs and get an end to to all the oil that was available. That's
fantastic. And I would say there's a story, part of the story that we haven't read, the Lawrence of Arabia story, I believe, is a part of this as well. And yes. Which is sort of this bringing civilization to the Arab peoples because we're going to get the oil. And that was a really interesting part of the story. So thank you for adding that. I do think that when we're talking about political machinations, that there's always going to be power structures that are economically motivated in all of this, and that's part why it doesn't take hold. You have to remember as well that there were forces. There was a Muslim Waqf, right? There was a Muslim administrative leadership in Jerusalem, and they had already demonstrated a partnership and alliances with the Britons and later with the Germans. And because they were an organized political structure, they had influence, which was putting up resistance. Okay. So yeah, there's a lot of that, right? And we'll see what happens as that continues to unfold. All right, Fran, thank you. Please read a little bit.
Although the image of Palestine as a land without a people was most commonly advanced by Christian proponents of a Jewish return to Palestine, it would be wrong to ascribe the perception of Palestine as a land without a people only to Christians. In the context of the 19th century and the many nationalist movements that captured the Western imagination, the notion of a Jewish restoration in Palestine seemed logical, even without religious motivations.
Just pause. I just want to pause because I know it's a lot of stuff. I've tried, hopefully you're seeing what has been explained here and the picture that we're painting, right? Which is, and I want to reiterate it because the words underscore what I've said. The world was thinking about nations at this time. The reason why after 2,000 years, there was going to be a move towards establishing a state of Israel is because the rest of the world was thinking that way. It's not like there was a 2,000 years longing, right? Jews always wanted to return to their land, but you know what? They're pretty happy in Spain until they got kicked out, and they're pretty happy in the Pale until they got, subjected to pogroms, and they would have been happy in Argentina, and they would have been happy in the United States. They would have been happy wherever, right? We're pretty easygoing people when it comes to that. Except in the 19th and 20th century, there was this push. Please continue.
In 1891, William Blackstone sent an open letter known today as the Blackstone Memorial to U.S. President Benjamin Harrison. Why shall not the powers which under the Treaty of Berlin in 1878 gave Bulgaria to the Bulgarians and Serbia to the Serbians now give Palestine back to the Jews? These provinces, as well as Romania, Montenegro, and Greece, were wrested from the Turks and given to their national owners. Does not Palestine as rightfully belong to the Jews? 19th century Westerners associated people or nations with territory. And so to be a land without a people did not imply that the land was without people, only that it was without a national political character.
Very good. Everybody understand what's talking about? This is not about boundaries. Remember, we studied history. We were transcending boundaries. This isn't about, and especially like based on Jeannie's comment, right? Because when we talk about the land of Israel, which has virtually no oil, right? We're like, at least on the continent itself, right? There's this concept that we always say, like, couldn't the dinosaurs have made a left turn instead of a right turn when they were like traveling from Africa, right? So it's not about the boundaries of the land. It's about a national political character, that there is a people who have a unique cultural and a religious and a social commonality. And that commonality deserves its own right to self-determination. Go ahead and read one more paragraph.
What may be odd, viewed from the Arab perspective, is the lens through which Westerners look at the land. In Western eyes, the Eastern Mediterranean is permanently overlaid with the outline of the territory called the Holy Land, or the Land of Israel. Because Westerners equate land with peoples, even post-Christian Westerners expect to find a people identified and coterminous with the Holy Land. Muslims, however, neither perceive Palestine as a distinct country nor Palestinians as a people. In Ottoman times, the Holy Land and its moderately valuable agricultural districts were subject to rule from Beirut or Damascus, where many of the wealthy Arab families who owned land in Palestine lived. In this period, Arabs thought of the Holy Land as an integral part of Syria, The Muslim perception of Syria and Palestine as distinct countries developed in the 20th century. In Arab eyes, in the pre-World War I period, all of Balad Sham, including portions Christians and Jews saw as the Holy Land, was an integral part of Arab domains and not a separate.
Very nice. Okay. So I'm sorry, go ahead and finish it up. There's one more line.
Advocates of a Jewish return to Israel, when they thought about the Arab inhabitants at all, assumed the existing Arab population would continue in residence after a Jewish state was established. This outcome appeared workable, since all nation states include ethnic minorities among their citizens.
Very good. Okay, thank you so much. Really interesting piece, right? So like when we're starting to unfold the political understanding, and we're going to begin to talk about why is this such a problem for the world, right? Why is Israel still such a contentious place? One of the things that is a major argument on the side of the Arab narrative is to say that this claim of a land without a people for a people without a land is patently false. There were people that were living there. We can prove that people were living there. This is the concept that you hear after the establishment of the state, where Palestinians, who aren't yet Palestinians, but the people living in the land, are considered refugees. They're considered exiled from their land because of the war that took place and the expulsion that resulted from the war. Now, in some respect, yes, they were refugees of the war, but certainly allowed to return to the land, especially what that last paragraph teaches us. These people were more than welcome to return to the land, even to be their own people. And they could have embraced the sense of becoming citizens of the state of Israel, which, by the way, has 10 to 15%, I don't know what the exact number is, of the current Israel population is non-Jewish, Arab, Palestinian, multicultural inhabitants. The idea that there is such a large portion of the minority that is not Jewish in the state, that has full voting rights, even an ability to be serving in positions of leadership in the government, tells you from the outset that the mindset of a land for a people without a land, which started this, didn't mean that it was only for these people. What it means is this is a land without a national identity. And you have the Mufti of Jerusalem, which was kind of a legal, a governmental figure. These were people that were representatives of the Muslim populations at the time, at the turn of the 20th century, and they were clearly vociferously opposed to this. But there was no infrastructural relationship between this leadership body and the services that it provided. It needed to take a state in order for all of that to be established. That's what we're learning from this comment. Okay, Judy.
When did this hatred of the Jews start with the Arabs? I read that the Hajj, and it was already, they wanted them all dead then. But with all of this that we're reading now, was it apparent then?
Well, so
Was the Arabs and the Jews?
Right. It's a great story, and just a very quick response, but it's worth studying, is that as Islam emerges in the world, remember, it's 1,000 years old by this time, okay, more or less, right? Maybe a little bit more than 1,000 years old. It's been on the world stage, and there are 100 times more Muslims than there are Jews in the world, okay, because of the sort of like lands that they occupy and all the other things. So in the Quran, there are many places where Jews are they're vilified, because they're like in the opposite narrative of Abraham. They're the sons of of Isaac, and Isaac is not the one that gets Abraham's blessing, but Ishmael is the one, right? They're the children of Ishmael. So therefore they say they're always going to be like an inferior class. Then you have, no, they're to be respected. And there's a lot of like affection for Jewish identity. You can be Jewish in Muslim lands freely. You can be outward of with your Jewish identity in many places, because Muslims understand from their reading of the Quran that Jews are, partners, brothers, right? Which is great, right? That's why here we are in 2020, and these things called the Abraham Accords exist. Because at the fundamental core, they didn't have to reestablish that these people, at one point they hated each other and they're like creating a brotherhood. They're brothers, we're cousins. And it's about us finding our mutual benefit together. So I know that was a little bit longer for a quick response, but the point is that what you would call the hatred, that does definitely emerge from some of this stuff that we're reading right now. Okay? Land for a people without a land. The concept that they're going to come and create a government in a land that the people used to occupy that was sort of under the control of a mufti, of an Arab leader, but had no governmental control, no structure. And here come the Israelis. This is the Hajj. Here come the Israelis, and they set up their, they set up their rules, and they set up their land, and they're at the top of the hill and not the bottom of the hill, right?
And they were successful. They built all this stuff and farmed and.
One last comment from the thing. I hope everybody's engaged. I know I'm speaking passionately, but like in the last thing that we read, did you see that Israel or Palestine was a major agricultural center? So it's not like the Jews came and it was completely desolate. There was plenty of fertile ground and it was being grown. But where did the Arab leaders live? They lived in Beirut and they lived in Damascus. In other words, nobody wanted to live in that land because that land was at best a place where you went to cultivate the farmland. It's kind of like, having migrant workers come up from Mexico. That's kind of like how the Arab world viewed that place, right? It's a great place to grow stuff, but we'd never want to live there. Jews wanted to live there, right? Right? We want to be free in our land. Okay. Any other comments for the moment? Good. Let's take a break. It's 11:45. 5 minutes. Okay. You know what 5 minutes means. See you soon. Okay, everybody, welcome back. Nice to see us after our 5-ish minute break. And what we're going to do is we're going to spend the final moments. We're going to talk about the charter of Zionism and the World Zionist Congress that was propounded by Max Nordau. And then we're going to read a little bit about the Uganda plan itself. And just, I want you to get a flavor of like, how are they writing and talking about this so that you understand kind of like what it was that they were aspiring toward. And then those will be our text today. Any sort of lingering thoughts before we jump back into our learning after you took your break? All right, we're feeling pretty good? Yeah? So, okay, good. Let's go. I don't know if I cooked your noodle too much or it's just it's a lot to hold on to. Okay, so let's see. Who has not yet read? Anybody not yet read? Lauren, have you read yet?
No.
Would you like to read?
Sure. Where am I starting?
So it says, in the version submitted to the Congress.
In the version submitted to the Congress on the second day of its deliberations, August 30th, by a committee under the chairmanship of Max Nordau, it was stated, the aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home of Eretz Israel secured by law. To meet halfway the request of the numerous delegates, the most prominent of who was Leon Makskin, who sought the inclusion of the phrase by international law, a compromise formula proposed by Herzl was eventually adopted. Zionism seeks to establish a home for the Jewish people in Eretz Israel secured under public law. The Congress contemplates the following means to the attainment of this end. 1, promotion by the appropriate means of the settlement in Eretz Israel of farmers, artisans, and manufacturers. 2, the organization of uniting of the whole of Jewry by means of appropriate institutions by local and international in accordance with the laws of each country. 3, the strengthening and fostering of Jewish national sentiment and national consciousness. 4, preparatory steps towards obtaining the consent of governments where necessary in order to reach the goals of Zionism.
Okay, so stop right there for a second before we get to the comment on it. So basically, there are four. So the definition of Zionism. What is Zionism? Political Zionism. Political Zionism, by definition, is what you see in the middle of the page. It is the attempt to establish a home for the Jewish people in Eretz Yisrael, okay, the land known as Israel, secured under public law. So it should be known by the world that this entity exists with its borders and all kinds of governmental responsibilities. And here's how we propose to accomplish this. This is written in 1897. Okay. So we promote this by people settling the land. We organize with institutions that are local and international according to the laws. So we want to do not only financing, but social and cultural institutions. And then there's a sense of national consciousness, right? There's nothing about a military. There's nothing about conquering. There's nothing about occupation. It's about national sentiment and national consciousness, which is different than what you would say is the Jewish people, right? Before this, the Jewish people were those that you would meet in the synagogue. This is the Jewish people who are from all over the world with all different kinds of places and points of connection. And then finally, obtaining the consent, and here I would underscore the affirmation, the acceptance of governments to reach these goals, okay? Which it doesn't take place until 1947 when the UN Partition Plan is approved, and then in 1948 when Israel declares independence and the rest of the world begins to affirm that, okay? Go ahead and finish this up, Lauren.
At the Congress, Herzl was elected president of the Zionist organization and Max Nudal, one of the 3 vice presidents. Thereafter, the Zionist Congress met every year, 1897 to 1901, in every second year, 1903, 1913, 1921, 1939. Since World War II, meetings have been held approximately every 4 years.
Okay, all right, thank you very much. So there is still a World Zionist Congress. There is still a World Zionist Organization. So this is 2022. Which makes this the 130th year? I forgot, whatever. There's like some sort of big number, 150th year of Herzl or something like that, maybe of his life. There was a big deal. And every 4 years, there are delegates from all around the world who are assigned to the World Zionist Congress. Have you ever participated in these elections? It's kind of like, if you're a Jewish person and you can vote, you can cast a vote. You just go online and you're like, I'm Jewish, and I think you need to have some sort of attachment belonging to some kind of organization. And every time that there is an election, what happens is the World Zionist Congress forms itself. They have a great gathering of Jews, and they learn and they talk about the sort of issues that are affecting Zionism and the Jewish people of the moment. And then there's also an opportunity, because if you remember back in 1897, when they had the first Congress, they developed this trust. There's money. There's money that gets apportioned out to Jewish communities all throughout the world, whether they're in Israel or whether they're in other parts of the world. Specifically in Israel, so for example, for those of you that are members of the Reform movement, the Reform organization in Israel is called the World Union for Progressive Judaism. And they have delegates that go to the World Zionist Congress, And those people then, if they vote, they have an ability to allocate funds that will support projects that are related to Zionism that are supported by the World Progressive Union for Progressive Judaism. So this is a way that the organization, unlike, it's not a government, it's more like it's a Congress, but it's like a supportive nonprofit, right? Like, but there's tons of money that is used for it. So every year they met, and now every 4 years. And then here you see sort of what's the purpose. The purpose is to promote the settlement of Israel, promote the growth of institutions in the world that are related to Israel, and also to continue to gain legitimacy in Israel. What do you respond to this? What are you missing here? What would you expect from this when you hear about Zionism? What feels like it rings true? What is kind of missing from that? Because I think that, when you hear Iran say this is the Zionist regime, you hear the term being used very negatively. So what's missing that you would assume would be there? Barbara, what do you think?
Well, there's nothing about religion.
Right? There's nothing about culture either, right? I mean, there is Jewish artists. It does say.
Yeah, it did say
right?
that, but I mean,
And
like, there's
farmers.
nothing about, to promote more Jews.
Right.
It's just, this is where you can go. This is where you can live. You can work, you can create, but we're not there. I assume they left it off on purpose.
Absolutely. It's absolutely left out on purpose.
There's no God, there's no Torah, all of that's.
It's not that there's no God, it's not that there's no Torah, but in the sort of construction of what is political Zionism, there is no necessary place for religion or for religious Zionism or even an organized cultural thing. So bring together farmers and artists and manufacturers, right? But they're all working towards this, political project. Jay, did you want to say something? You took your hand and then, are you okay?
Maybe I missed it. Is there any mention of an army?
No, that's the other piece that I was also thinking, right? So when you hear Zionism, you think, well, that means that they have to organize themselves and protect themselves against all of the sort of, defenders. They have to defend themselves against all of the intruders in the world that are going to try to undermine them. No, actually, Zionism has nothing to do with a military thing, right? You know what? Militaries are the instruments of governments to enforce the rules, right? Or protect the borders. Zionism is not about borders and it's not about rules. It's about an idea of national consciousness and national unity. Fran, you had your hand up, then Sherry.
Really doesn't mention anything about the peoples that are living there already.
Exactly, right? And it's not excluding them. It just says it's not our right. That's not our domain. However, you're very right to bring it up because that is the motivating force behind the conflict that exists, is the sense that there was a neglect or a blatant refusal to acknowledge that there were other peoples in existence in the land at the time from this document. Okay, we've read other stuff that says, of course, right? Remember that last thing that we read, a land without a people for a people without a land? Doesn't mean that it's, it's about national consciousness. Sherry. Unmute.
Are in the World Zionist Organization are all what's the word? Reformed or conservative Orthodox involved?
Yeah.
What do
you mean involved?
I mean, are they all part of it? Is it Democratic? Do they all?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
It's kind of not great, but that's just sort of how it is. Meaning that they have elections, and there's total politicking, and there's it's not I mean, it's kind of representative, but basically because the World Zionist Congress is not the state of Israel, or it's not the American Jewish Congress, by the way, right? Or some other, the American Congress, right? It's not a governmental body. It's an organization that supports the Zionist project. That everybody can be a part of it, and the politicking is all about how many people can you get to vote for your group so that you get the most number of delegates so that you can vote for the most amount of money that comes your way. And it's a little like whatever. Study it more, you might have a different feeling than I do. Lauren.
I mean, Zionists, to me, it always, it's like a hotbed discussion. I could remember as a little girl being at my grandmother's house, my father and my uncles arguing about Zionism. You're a Zionist, you're a Zionist. And to me, it always like brought up like the very negative views. I mean, like this doesn't seem so negative, like when you define it, but back then it just seemed like it wasn't good to be a Zionist. But now I don't know if I feel that way anymore. I don't know.
I'm a little unclear on what your comment is. Try it again.
Well, maybe the Zionists change over the years. Like it wasn't good to be a Zionist at one point, and now it's good to be a Zionist. I mean, I just remember back, and of course you're talking many, many years, my uncles and my father arguing about you're a Zionist, no, you're a Zionist, and it didn't seem to be like a good thing to be a Zionist. I don't
Very
know.
good. Now I understand, right? So like, here's an interesting thing. The Reform movement in America was initially quite opposed to the establishment of the land of the state of Israel. Why? Because Reform Judaism was thriving in the United States, right? Like, we don't need Israel. Look at all of that. Look at all that, stuff that's going on. Zionism saying that we need a people for a land without a people, that idea, it wasn't something that resonated with the Reform movement. But then, I mean, really sort of the history of it was in 1967, when there was a firm establishment of the state and it was able to defend itself, then the Reform movement became one of its ardent and staunch supporters, and Zionism really did push from the direction of the Reform movement. So there were shifts that took place. Zionism as a concept, the political influence to ensure that there was a land there was a place in the world where Jews could be, that wasn't something that was appealing to the world. I mean, look, if you guys are seeing this Ken Burns documentary that's coming out,
Yeah.
and there's this realization, I mean, we knew this, but like it's a realization that American Jews didn't really want they didn't want the Jews from Europe to come into America. Right, there was some resistance from the American Jewish community because they didn't know that they were being, incinerated in the crematoria. There was a little bit of that kind of like attitude that said, we got it good here. Why do we need to rock the boat? And that's kind of like what Zionism had for an attitude for many people for many years. We got it good here, right? Think about England. Lord Balfour says to Lord Rothschild, or Alfred Balfour says to Lord Rothschild, we have a really good relationship. The Jews should have a land in Israel, right? And it wasn't to sort of get rid of them. It was just be like, go be there, right? Go, we have enough land to give away for free, right? And that was kind of the attitude. And the Rothschilds of the world were like, okay, fine, but you know what? It's not like we need it, right? It was only after World War II that there was this very clear imperative that nowhere else was possible. And it was in no small measure for us to acknowledge that the Holocaust was a part of the catalyst. It was the impetus to ensure that a state was formed. Jay, you had your hand up, then Jeannie.
Yes, I have a couple of questions. One, I've read that Stephen Weiss was against Israel and against Jews coming into this country. Is that the same Stephen Weiss that whose temple I go to?
Yes, no, yes, it is, but it's but it's a different synagogue, right? Now the Stephen Weiss. So Stephen Weiss was a great North American rabbi, right? He was one of the most eloquent public speakers. Madison Square Garden, right? The Jews that arrived when Stephen S. Wise spoke at Madison Square Garden in front of thousands, and it was super public. And then he formed this synagogue called the Free Synagogue. Have you heard about this? Okay, so just very quickly, right? So Stephen S. Wise was, a really great rabbi, and what happened was he wanted to get hired by a congregation. They were like, Rabbi, we want you to speak from this pulpit. It was like the greatest pulpit in New York at the time, but we want to review your sermons before. You have to give us your sermons. And he was like, no. And that's when he went to go form the Free Synagogue, because it wasn't free membership. It was that freedom of the pulpit. I want to say what I want to say, and you're not going to tell me what you're going to want to tell me. So that's the Wise Temple that's now here in Los Angeles. And yeah.
So he switched. He changed his tune, I guess, after World War II.
I don't know. I don't know.
Originally against it.
Yeah, I don't know I'm not familiar with his story, so I can't speak any truth to that. I'm sure that somebody can sort of figure that out and help us understand it. But he was certainly he was the representative of the American Jewish community that said the state of Israel is no good. It's bad for the Jews. Okay?
The other question I have is,
go ahead.
It's maybe not really important, but I'm just curious that, this Zionist Congress, is it corrupt? I mean, who handles the money, and who decides whether money's going to the Reformed or the Conservative? How does that work?
Well, that's what they do in the Congress, is they come and they, battle it out. And the more delegates that you have, the more money you get. It's not a corrupt organization at all. And it's usually, it's very parve in its influence today. It used to have a greater significance. It's an interesting story. It's an interesting story to continue study. We'll come back to it when we talk about where do we go from here. Okay, Jeannie.
I just wanted to kind of agree with what Lauren was saying, that my experience too, when I was younger, when they were just initially talking about a Jewish state in Palestine, I think my parents, who were very, and grandparents were very politically liberal, to put it nicely, I think that they felt that this was an attempt to get rid of the Jews, and they did not see it in a positive way.
Right. That's an interesting point. And so Israel was the place for the people that nobody else wants, or the existence of it would threaten the security and freedom that we enjoy in the place that we live. So for those reasons, none of them were satisfactory to the. And it was primarily a liberal establishment, right? I mean, the Reform movement in general is a liberal movement. Doesn't mean that there aren't conservatives that are part of the Reform movement, but as a liberal movement, progressive, perhaps is the more appropriate word, the concept of national identity had already sort of worn itself thin. I mean, that was one of the powerful lessons of World War II. National identity, look what happened. The National Socialist Party wreaked havoc over Europe and murdered millions and millions of people. Most of them are people. How could you say that having a national identity is a good thing? That would be the argument. All right, let's take a few minutes to wrap up our a little bit of study today. And this is about the Uganda plan. So let's see. Roberta P., hi, you've been so quiet today. I hope everything's okay.
Yes.
Will you read for us? Uganda,
sure.
How about Alaska?
When Theodor Herzl began his quest to establish a homeland for the Jewish people, he sought out the support of the great powers to help achieve his goal. In 1903, Herzl turned to Great Britain and met with Joseph Chamberlain, the British colonial secretary, and other high-ranking officials who agreed in principle to Jewish settlement in East Africa. At the Sixth Zionist Congress at Basel on August 26, 1903, Herzl proposed to the British Uganda program as a temporary refuge for Jews in Russia in immediate danger. By a vote of 295 to 178, it was decided to send an expedition investigatory commission to examine the territory proposed. 3 days later, the British government released an official document allocating Jewish territory in East Africa on conditions which will enable members to observe their national customs.
So pause there for a second. All right, so pay attention to what we read here. So this is, so if in the other text that we read, 1903 was a pivotal moment because historically what had happened in Russia, there was the Kishinev massacres. So major horrible pogroms had swept Eastern Europe and Russia. And so therefore the imperative to find a Jewish homeland, a sanctuary for Jews, was accelerated. So Herzl was looking at the world. He had already identified the world's not going to accept us, and the world, you know, as much as we enjoy the freedoms of Germany, like, you know, we're just never going to have it. It was prophetic, but they didn't have Israel yet because, you know, this was 1903, not 1917, when Balfour says you guys can have Palestine. So so they said, let's go to Uganda. So they're like, okay, go ahead, and you can observe your national customs in Uganda. Why Uganda? Because it was part of the British Empire, and you know what? There were people living in Uganda, but apparently it was not meant to be. So please continue reading.
While Herzl made it clear that this program would not affect the ultimate aim of Zionism, a Jewish entity in the land of Israel, the proposal aroused a storm at the Congress and nearly led to a split in the Zionist movement. The Jewish Territorialist Organization was formed as a result of the unification of various groups who had supported Herzl's Uganda proposals during the period of 1903 to 1905. The Uganda program was finally rejected by the Zionist movement at the 7th Zionist Congress in 1905, but Nahum Sirkin and Israel Zangwill called an alternative conference to continue the plan of the Uganda scheme.
So as you're reading this little bit of history, what's the significant moment between 1903 and 1905 that happens? Herzl dies. Herzl dies in 1904, and because Herzl dies in 1904, guess what happens? The Uganda plan is dropped, okay? But Zangwill and Sirkin, these are guys that revive it because they saw what Herzl saw, which was, if the world won't have us and they're going to kill us, we need someplace, somehow. Please continue.
The fortunes of the territorialist movement depended to no small degree on the seriousness of anti-Semitism on the one hand, and the failure of the political dimensions of Zionist activity on the other. So, for example, the movement's ranks swelled somewhat following the pogroms in 1905, but declined considerably after the securing of the Balfour Declaration. Zangwill became the movement's undisputed leader. After the rejection of the Uganda scheme on the grounds of impracticality by the British, Zangwill turned his attention to settlement in Canada and Australia. But opposition from local residents led him to abandon the scheme. Expeditions were sent to Mesopotamia, Iraq, Libya, and Angola, but little came of these expeditions.
Right? Fascinating. Go ahead and just finish it up.
A project that had some concrete success was a Galveston scheme, which contemplated the settlement of Jews in the American Southwest, in particular Texas. The project received the assistance of Jacob Schiff, the American Jewish banker, and some 9,300 Jews arrived in that area between 1907 and 1914 through the Immigration Bureau of the Territorialist Organization. With the publication of the Balfour Declaration, the ITO faced a severe crisis since many of its members came to the conclusion that Eretz Israel was not so utopian after all. The organization's failure was due to its inability to secure a definite project and its lack of sensitivity toward the historic and traditional sentiments of Jewish identity.
Thank you. Okay, so hold on to this stuff. I just want to show you, this is an artifact. This is the actual letter that proposes the Uganda plan. The reason that I want to bring it to you is not to give you more words, but I want you to just see a couple things, right? So look at let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If a site paragraph. If a site can be found which the trust and His Majesty's Commissioner considered suitable, which commends itself to His Majesty's government, Lord Lansdowne will be prepared to entertain favorably proposals for the establishment of a Jewish colony or settlement on conditions which will enable the members to observe their national customs. Okay? And then so on and so forth. What do you see out of this? That's 1903, by the way. What do you see out of this? This is a lot of language. That's all I got to say. And the second thing is that, like, don't you remember in the show Hamilton, when Aaron Burr and Hamilton are writing letters to each other? I am, sir, your most obedient, humble servant, Clement Hill, right? A.Ham, A.Burr. So I just thought that this was great. I wanted you to see this as an artifact because I want you to see that these pieces, you know, it's not just to have an idea. It's not just to say the Jews should have a homeland, right? To move something politically involves significant effort. Think about that now, right? How would you really, really inspire political change? There's so much that we want to see change in our world right now. And what do we do primarily, right? We shout and scream and beat our chests and go to social media and, like, you know, have a bunch of people agree with us. But does it bring real change? It's hard. It's really hard. I mean, just think about, like, you know, the big issues that are racking this country with gun violence and stuff like that, right? Like, it's just hard to enact or to inspire political change. So here are these letters that represent, like, how difficult it was. And listen to the story, right? So they thought of Uganda. Uganda wasn't working because the British Empire determined that it was impractical. So they said, let's go to Galveston, Texas. Crazy. I've also heard Arizona, because at this time, Arizona wasn't a state yet. I think that's also true. Didn't Arizona become a state? And it was like the last state to enter the Union, something like around 48. Is that true? Right? I have to I'm going to find this out. Arizona, pardon me for taking us off the screen.
February 14th, 1912.
1912. Okay, thank you. So
Why was it Texas then?
because Jacob Schiff.
Oh.
Yeah, Jacob Schiff was the guy who wanted Texas, and he was a very wealthy American banker, and he was like, I'm going to put money towards it. They're like, Galveston, right? Why Galveston? Because Galveston is a port city. It's easy to emigrate there. Okay. It's near Houston, right?
Okay.
And very significant piece of history. All right. So what I want you to see is that in this last piece, which was significant, is that those ideas were still in play until 1917. At the moment that the Balfour Declaration was made, that was another pivotal shift. And even though there was always in the back of our minds some other place where the Jews could be in the world, like Jeannie had brought up, Alaska would never suffice, nor would Galveston, nor would Libya, nor would Iraq, nor where's the one, Australia, right? Like, forget it, right? None of these places were going to work. It was only going to be what was called Palestine at the time, and it was only going to be this land of Israel. Knowing that that's the case, that actually sets the stage for the conversation that we're going to have in the coming weeks. Where do we go from here? Knowing that this was the sort of like focal point. What does it mean for us to now have conversations with people who don't want us there, people who have a competing narrative? How do we begin to have a conversation? Because it's not a matter of stubbornness, right? We tried to go to other places. I would submit, we tried to go to other places in the world. There was no other place. That's the end of the story. So since there's no other place, how are we going to make the place that we live in work? Any questions or comments? Stunning. I didn't upset you, did I? Or we're just tired after learning? Okay, good. Well, have an amazing week. We're going to end a couple minutes early. Okay. Something to hold on to, right? If this is the only place after all of this story, right? Where do we go from here? Now that we have a state, what is it that we're going to be doing? So we'll study a little bit about formation of state and recognition of the state among the other nations in the world, and how is it that we sort of garner legitimacy and also maintain legitimacy amongst what we call the comity, not comedy, comity, COMITY of nations, right? How are we part of the national landscape? How is Israel a relevant national force for good in the world? Okay. Sounds like we got work to do. Have a wonderful week, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank